One's a bit different. I thought it would be an interesting subject because I've been watching the Final Destination films recently, and they're entirely based on the subject of premonitions. They're supernatural horrors, described as supernatural horrors, but they are always start with the main protagonist having a premonition of some big disaster. In the six films, there has been a plane crash, um, a highway crash, pile up of cars, um, bridge collapse, Skyview Tower collapse, as we saw in Bloodlines, a roller coaster disaster, um, and a racing track disaster. I think that's all of them. Um, so it always starts with that idea of a central character having a premonition of these things before they happen. It's been a very successful series, and I'm a fan of the films. I think they're well made, generally. But I thought this would actually be a good subject. Now, there's many accounts, and I'm not going to go into details about individual accounts here, because I can't do the split screen thing at the moment, and there is a lot. But what I'm going to do is put some links to them. I'm going to cite some famous cases and then some not so famous cases. With premonitions, there's been a lot of accounts of people envisaging, particularly in aviation, some sort of plane crash happening. There was a case in Britain of a man who warned the RAF about, at the time it was in the 1990s, I think it was Russian incursion going on in our airspace. Now that was already known to the RAF, but I think he had some details that only they could have known. And initially he was interviewed by the police. I don't remember the precise details, but I remember seeing this in a documentary. There has been another case in the United States. A woman in California kept having uncomfortable dreams about women going missing, and they turned out to be so accurate in details that the FBI actually brought her in, um, to look into some of the stuff she thought about a friend, um, or an acquaintance. I may be getting some of the details wrong. I'm just remembering this off the top of my head. But if you look at, I think it's Final Destination 3, there's a little documentary in that that actually, or it might be the second film that actually recounts some of this stuff. It's worth checking out. One that I was not familiar with, and I'm going to mention it in this video, is Aberfan. Now, in Britain, Aberfan was an infamous disaster that occurred in a small Welsh village in 1966. What happened was that slag, that is the residue from coal mining, had been built up and there was heavy rain. And this was dangerously high. It was serious negligence. And after heavy rainfall, there was a landslide and it buried the school beneath. And sadly, a lot of children and teachers died. It was an infamous disaster in this country. It was recounted in one of the episodes of The Crown. But I've literally just found out today some of the children involved had premonitions of the event. What happened was there was a psychiatrist, John Barker, I believe his name was, gathered some of this information after the disaster. And two cases are particularly ominous. A young boy called Paul Davies, who drew a picture the day before the landslide of people digging in the hill. This had actually built up a sort of hill over the school and written the end on it. And a girl by the name of Errol May had spoken of something black covering the school, and she said to her mother she was not afraid to die. Now, this was both on the day before the disaster happened. That's one of the most infamous disasters in 20th century Britain. So that's eerie, and I've only just found out about that now. I don't know if it's because if you want to be skeptical, you could say, well, there was already safety concerns going on. Maybe the children just heard that, but I think that's quite creepy. Um, there's been other famous events that have had premonitions. Now, I've got a book, I haven't read it yet, The Wreck or Futility. The full title is The Wreck of the Titan or Futility by Morgan Robertson. And this book, at the time, it was a relatively successful book, but it got even more traction after the sinking of the Titanic. This book was published in 1898, not this specific copy, this is a copy, but the original was published in 1898. And what's eerie about it is the way the ship is described. It's a British liner on its maiden voyage with the name Titan that hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic I think in the novel it's 2,000 people die, in the disaster it was 1,500, but the details are eerily similar. Um, a British liner on its maiden voyage, Southampton to New York. You know the details. I haven't read it yet, so I don't know how many other details are similar. With that one, it's interesting more than necessarily a premonition. He wrote it not as a premonition, but as a novel. And critics would point out, well, he knew about the maritime industry. He knew what shipping routes were. He knew what the trajectory was of maritime architecture at the time, i.e., shipbuilding at the time. So perhaps it wasn't a stretch to think of a British liner in those sort of dimensions. But the fact they gave it the name Titan, okay, you can argue that just means a large object. I mean, the word Titanic as a noun actually just meant a large object, and it's been used ever since to describe large things. Um, but that's certainly, I think, more coincidence than a premonition, but still quite interesting. But people who sailed on the ship themselves famously had premonitions. I heard of one, and it's not recounted in any of the sources that I'm going to put here. But there was a young girl in Kirkcudbright, of all places, where my parents lived for a while, in Scotland. She had no connection to the ship. She didn't know anyone on it. She obviously wasn't on it. But on the morning of the 13th of April, the day before the sinking, she apparently had an uncomfortable feeling about a ship sinking in the North Atlantic. Now, again, the skeptic might say, well, there had been previous shipwrecks. You know, it can be a dangerous body of water, but it's just a bit of an eerie coincidence. Um, Other things, 9/11 is connected with some premonitions, both the Kennedy and Lincoln assassinations. Mary Todd Lincoln, who had a history of mental illness, apparently was very uneasy about her husband. She was supposed to have had a premonition. The president himself apparently did. JFK apparently had written something down. This was later discovered in presidential archives, where he said that a storm is coming and I'm ready for God, or something to that effect. Now, I don't read too much into that because that may have just been a president reflecting on the massive responsibility of his job. So I'd be a little bit, take that one with a bit of caution. There's been other prominent events. But anyway, I'm just putting it out there. I'm going to put links to these articles because they go into much more details. There's more specific cases. There's been numerous. What I've cited some very famous cases, but there's been some other cases that aren't as famous that are just as interesting. People having dreams or premonitions beforehand and that thing actually happening. Sometimes it's people just getting an uneasy feeling and deciding not to take a particular journey that end up in a disaster. So what do people think of this? A big one is World War One. Apparently, Carl Jung, the prominent Swiss psychiatrist, um, had a dream or an image of Europe being swept in a massive flood, as he put it. Um, Again, I'm not so sure about that because there were build-up events to World War One. It was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was the precise trigger, but there was the Balkan Wars in 1913 when Jung had this dream. So I'm not sure that that's entirely a premonition. There was a lot of things leading up to World War One. There was building tensions. Nevertheless, it's an interesting subject. What do people think? Are people skeptical? Do they think it's pure coincidence? I honestly don't know. I think that some things that are just too precise to be dismissed as just coincidence. And I do wonder, do some people have a sort of foresight? Is there something there? Um, I don't know. I don't think it can be entirely dismissed. And I think an open-minded person should look at this stuff with just that, an open mind. Um, do I believe that people can predict the future? Not necessarily, but I mean, if we want to get into that, maybe it's another subject. Nostradamus is a famous example, but there was also a figure in Britain called Murphy Wilt. To use the Welsh, and probably pronouncing that wrong. He was thought to be the inspiration for the character Merlin in the Arthurian tales. Some years ago, I watched a documentary on the whole 2012 prophecies. Now, of course, that didn't happen. The world's still here. But this character, Murphy Wilt, apparently wrote about in the 21st century a man on the shores of England speak to a man on the shores of France using a talking stone. Well, what do we think of? We think of mobile phone, smartphone technology. Who knows? And the world would be covered in a web. Is one of the things I believe he put out. I don't remember all the details of that documentary. If I find it, I'll try and link it. But it's interesting stuff. So let me know your thoughts. Do you believe that premonitions are a thing? Do you think it's pure coincidence, or do you think that some people really do have some sort of foresight? And if so, what do you think that is? Do you think it could be that those people experience a trauma in their life that's then being reflected? Perhaps anyone with some background in psychiatry could have a view on this. I don't know. I think the Aberfan one for me is particularly eerie, and I've just discovered that today as I was looking into some of the material for this video. I'll put some of the links. There's an article from The Guardian, there's a few other things. Let me know your thoughts on premonitions.